Welcome to another episode of the Robinson-Hewitt Pod. This is where we talk about the future of technology and what it will mean to be human in the next era of tech. I'm your host, Alison Mackey. I'm a futurist, anthropologist of emerging technology, and founder of Robinson-Hewitt Consulting. Welcome. So I've been personally debating for a while now about where in the world I want to live next. I love being close to the beach and nature, but I'm such a city girl at heart. I love being close to art and wine bars and being amongst other people living out their own lives. And as I look across the map, thinking up potential lives I could be living out in different locations, I keep landing on the same question. What actually makes a city worth living in? Not worth investing in, not worth ranking on some livability index, but worth staying in, worth contributing to, and worth caring about. So what makes a city magical? Let's talk about the future of cities and how we resource and design them for the next era. Today, we'll be covering where they've come from, what's currently putting them under pressure, and what would a human-centered city look like if we had both the imagination and follow-through to actually build it. Today's episode, as always, will be equal parts historical, speculative, and practical. And I know I can fall into the futuristic, idealistic fever dream of what technology can do for us, but I've been working in the space for over a decade, and I've seen and heard it all. So I'll try to keep this as grounded as possible. But to be fair, some of the greatest tech ideas that are being built for cities are embedded, ambient, and aren't actually the focal point. So let's look at the current state of play of cities. Cities are one of the oldest technologies that humans have ever built. And this is not in a digital sense, but in the truest sense of the word. A city is almost a tool that was made to solve problems. We can see this in our early cities, which were built to solve the problem of proximity. If you cluster people together, and you can organize food, manage defense, create trade, and build specialized knowledge far faster than if everyone was scattered across a landscape doing everything alone. And that logic still holds. For thousands of years, cities have grown around this idea. And over time, they've become denser, taller, faster, and louder. But the Industrial Revolution turbocharged all of this. And what followed were cities that were designed almost entirely around productivity and movement, with factories, rail lines, ports, and roads. But the human element and the things that make us feel at home weren't exactly the top of the list. And from an anthropological standpoint, what's interesting is how quickly we've adapted. We naturally built cultures and subcultures around these environments, and we made them home, even if they weren't exactly how we were naturally built to live. But humans are masters at adapting, and we can find meaning in almost any setting we're placed in and attempt to create community in whatever gaps the architecture leaves us. But adaptation isn't the same as thriving. And what we're seeing right now in city after city around the world is the accumulation cost of designing places around output rather than people. And there's a whole other note on gentrification, but that is far too big of a conversation to start in this episode. But I will say along those lines that the challenges cities are facing are not just technical. They compound each other in ways that can be difficult to manage. We see this with climate vulnerability intensifying, infrastructure built 50 or 100 years ago that is aging faster than it is being replaced, housing that is becoming inaccessible in ways that fracture social cohesion, and services that people depend on, such as health, education, and transport, are frequently operating in isolation from each other, which means that the person who actually needs all three at once still has to navigate three completely separate systems. And underneath all of that, there's often the governance structure that wasn't designed for complexity at this scale. And I want to note that this isn't a critique of any particular kind of city or political system. It's more of a structural observation and leftovers from the past. Cities were designed for a different set of assumptions, and many of those assumptions no longer hold in today's standards. But a little over 10 years ago, I actually wrote and presented a paper on the social impact of smart cities, particularly in the context of the Christchurch city rebuild after the earthquakes. There was an opportunity for a fresh start within the city, and I was looking at what kinds of connected technology systems and solutions could make the city more livable and what the real barriers to adoption were. But over time, we can see that the ideas weren't actually the problem. There were brilliant ideas everywhere, and people who had them had thought deeply about what their community needed, who had mapped the gaps and imagined all the solutions. But what stopped most of these ideas from gaining traction was bureaucracy, fragmented decision-making, and of course, funding. So where does the funding come from? Who signs off on these things? Whose remit does it actually fall under? There's so many good ideas that were simply dissolved in the process of trying to find a home or funding for them. And that was a decade ago, and the problem hasn't fundamentally changed since. But I am hopeful that something else is shifting now, though. The conversation about what cities are for is getting louder, and it seems like the conversation's coming from all directions at once. So if we want to look at what a city could become in the future, we have to take a look back in time. If we go back far enough in urban history, we can find moments when cities were redesigned quite radically in response to crisis or changing values. So we can see this with Baron Haussmann's transformation of Paris in the 1850s and 60s as probably the most dramatic example. He tore through the medieval city and cleared enormous amounts of densely packed streets and built the wide boulevards, parks, and sewer systems that still define central Paris today. It was controversial as it displaced thousands of people, and it was driven partly by politics and partly by public health concerns after cholera outbreaks. The result was a city that was more functional in some ways and more inequitable in others. But it illustrated that cities can be fundamentally reconceived, and a crisis tends to be what makes that possible. And we see a similar pattern in post-war rebuilding of European cities. Cities like Rotterdam, Dresden, and Warsaw each had to decide what kind of city to build when they were handed a near blank slate after the war. Some chose to reconstruct what had been lost, and others chose to build something new. And the choices made in those years still shape how people live in those cities today. Or we could even look at Singapore, which made a deliberate decision in the 1960s and 70s to integrate greenery into its urban fabric as a matter of state policy. And Lee Kuan Yew coined it as a garden city. So what began as something that might have seemed primarily aesthetic became over time incredibly structural to how the city functions and thrives. The tree canopy now reduces urban heat in a measurable way. The green corridors support biodiversity within the cities, and the parks are in constant use because they're not only accessible but also clean. It's a beautiful example of nature as infrastructure, not just nature as decoration. And then there's my favorite concept of a 20-minute city, which has taken root in places like Paris and Melbourne. The goal is to ensure that everything a person needs for daily life is within a 20-minute walk or cycle from their home. It's a fantastic planning philosophy rooted in what human beings actually need in a course of the day. And I've lived within this model myself, having moved from Otago, Studentsville to Florence to Ponsonby and Auckland CBD, all of which are walkable areas. The only thing that's ever really been a genuine nuisance is the rain and the supermarket issues. Lugging bags across the city is a pain, but I would find it hard to move out of this 20-minute concept now. However, the pattern across all of these examples is the same. When cities work well for people, it's because someone made a deliberate choice to put the human and environmental well-being at the center of design. And I believe that choice is rarely the path of least resistance, but it almost always involves political will, public imagination, and the willingness to rethink what progress actually means. And that's where we can usually get stuck. So now it's time to take a look into my visions and see what I see as the future of cities. Let's take a stroll through some of the ideas I find the most compelling, and not because they're the most technologically dazzling, but because they do show a shift in a way that cities can actually be optimized for. And if you're in the city space, you're probably already very well versed with a few of these ideas. Personally, I think that the first and most fundamental shift is that cities stop being primarily engines of economic activity and start being designed as places that actively support human well-being. It sounds so simple, but it's a huge reorientation, and it mirrors how the workforce is moving these days. But the question we need to ask at the start of any planning process naturally has to change. So rather than how do we accommodate more growth, we need to ask, what do people actually need to live and work well here long term? And not just for the next decade, but for the next 100 years. And a simple shift in that question changes everything downstream. It changes how we think about noise, light, and green space. It changes how we design buildings, because buildings designed for human health looks completely different from buildings that were designed to maximize floor space. Here we can think about natural light, ventilation, low toxicity materials, and layouts that support both focus and social interaction. And I don't think these are necessarily luxuries, but design constraints that keep getting deprioritized. This reframing of this question can also change how we think about food. Things like urban agriculture, rooftop farms, community gardens, farmers markets, shorter supply chains, all of these ways of embedding food resilience into the city itself rather than making it entirely dependent on industrial systems hundreds of kilometers away. And there's something worth paying attention to in the social dimension of that too. Community gardens or farmers markets are not just about food. They're also about the relationships that people build around shared work and shared space. This reframing also changes how we think about transport, not just in terms of making it cleaner and energy efficient, but in terms of reducing the need for long daily movement in the first place. These are seen in mixed-use zoning, walkable neighborhoods, and distributed services. And all of these reduce the frustration we experience in our daily life with car-dependent cities. And I think we can all agree that the commute is one of the most reliable sources of misery-producing experiences in urban modern life. So designing it out of the system is not really an idealistic fantasy. Some cities are already making real progress on this. And this adds to the conversation we had in a previous episode on the future of transport with autonomous vehicles and the adoption of rideshare approaches. We'll link that episode below if you're interested in diving deeper. It's a good one to listen to. And finally, this reframing changes how we think about technology itself. The version of a smart city that got a lot of attention in the early 2010s was very much about the technology. Sensors everywhere, data dashboards, optimized traffic flows, the city as a kind of giant operating system. And this is important. It's almost like the nervous system of a city. But the framing put technology at the center of the story and people at the edge of it. And I'll be honest, I was very much into the data story at the time too, so I get it. And with the uptake of more ambient AI, there is so much cool stuff we could be doing here, but it shouldn't be the focal point. It should be more of an amplifier of what we're building. And with this, I find it far more interesting and durable for the future, the idea that technology is infrastructure for well-being, largely invisible in daily experience, but improving the overall system in the background. So this is smart energy grids that optimize renewable use without anyone having to think about it. Water and wastewater systems designed for circular reuse. AI that helps planners model climate risk and mobility patterns so that decisions are made better with evidence. Digital platforms that make it easier for residents to participate in planning decisions about their own neighborhoods, which honestly just makes sense. And one of the things that tends to get left out of this smart city conversation is governance. Participatory planning is not a new idea, but digital tools are making it more possible to do that at scale and to do it in ways that include people who historically couldn't even get to a town hall or vote at local elections. This has always been an issue with getting people to share their ideas and be active citizens who participate in decision-making processes. So with this in mind, I think that the future city I find most credible is the one where technology enables participation rather than replacing it. And data can do that for us. So if this is the future that we want to build, how do we actually get there? Because I'm aware that the gap between the ideas I've just described and the daily reality of most cities is fairly considerable. So let's think about this in terms of a crawl, walk, run approach, because building Rome didn't happen in a day. At the crawl stage, we're not trying to redesign anything. We're working towards building the conditions for better decisions. That means investing in data, especially in environmental monitoring, housing equity data, and civic participation tracking to actually understand what's happening clearly enough to make better decisions. This means creating spaces for people to participate, even small ones such as neighborhood planning sessions, designed to actually hear from real people. And it means making small changes to existing infrastructure that start to show signs of heading in a new direction. This could be more trees and street design, crossings that prioritize pedestrians, and pilot areas for mixed-use zoning. It's about putting the human at the forefront of planning first before anything else. At the walk stage, we're starting to make structural changes. So this is transport networks being redesigned around access rather than speed, energy systems that are starting to become decentralized and more environmentally conscious, local food infrastructure that is built into planning frameworks rather than added as an afterthought, and tech platforms that enable easy access civic participation in decisions being made about their own neighborhood. This is possibly where the hard work happens and where some cities currently sit. And most cities are in this liminal space between trying to do the new thing while managing legacy systems at the same time. It's going to be a balancing act for a while, and we'll see the old crumble slightly before we can fully hold the new. And finally, at the run stage, we're in a city that measures its success differently, not just through GDP or infrastructure delivery rates, but I believe through air quality, green space access, housing equity, civic participation, and long-term well-being. We'll see that the city's systems and its energy, its water, food, and transport and data are all designed to be resilient and adaptive rather than brittle and centralized. And the residents are contributors to the city, not just users of it, with meaningful ways to shape how it evolves and grows for the next generation. But what can you do yourself today? On an individual level, at the crawl stage, this is about paying attention to the city you actually live in. Take note of what's missing, what's working, where the friction is, as well as doing your part to tidy it up. We have a saying in New Zealand of being a tidy Kiwi, and it's been instilled with us since primary school to pick up rubbish wherever we go. And those ideas you have when you're observing your city can also mean taking these notes and engaging in the local planning processes when they're open in a more meaningful way, even when they're frustrating. And lastly, a simple act could also be supporting your local shops and neighbors, the ones that have been there for years or the ones that just opened up their dream wine bar. Where you spend your money is a vote, and those decisions always compound over time. At the walk stage, as an individual, it's about getting more active in community level initiatives. This can be going to more local and neighborhood groups, supporting local food projects, or the local markets and fairs. It can also be as simple as looking at what's happening in your city and committing to showing up to 1 or 2 things a month. I saw recently that people were complaining on Reddit that there's far too much happening in May in Auckland, and I have to agree. But I actually think that's a sign of something good, because a city thrives when people treat community events as a priority and not as an afterthought. And finally, at the run stage, this is about being the person in your field or organization who can bring the human question back at the table and what you're working on. Something as simple as asking, what does this do for the people who live here? That question, if asked consistently by enough people, changes the culture of how decisions get made. We love technology, but a city that becomes magical is one that helps humans feel more human. And it's at your table where decisions can also get made, not just at the local council level. So what's going on in your own life that you could be contributing to a better city? There is a lot more to say here in this topic, and I haven't even touched on the role of the private sector in civic building, which is its own complicated territory. I haven't talked in depth about what equitable access to these future cities actually looks like, which is probably the most important question of all, and one I could give a full episode to be honest. And I haven't talked about what it means to preserve the things that make a city feel like itself in terms of its texture, its culture, and imperfections, while also rebuilding it for the next 100 years. Because I think that's the real design challenge. Technology is not the constraint. Money is a constraint. Governance is a constraint. And the political will is also a constraint. But maybe the deepest challenge is how you hold on to what makes a place feel like home while also be willing to change it fundamentally. And maybe that is a good question for another episode. So if today's episode got you thinking, you can come along and join your journey with us. We post nearly every day on Instagram, sharing our daily insights and inspirations for founders and future-facing leaders. It's a good place to stay curious. And if you're ready to go deeper, you can head over to our website at RobinsonHewitt.com. We work at the intersection of anthropology, emerging technology, and future systems thinking, helping future-facing leaders, founders, and organizations build the next era. If you're still orienting, we have so many free resources available online, but if you're ready to take the leap, you can check out our services as well. And make sure to subscribe to next week's episode to help us build a better future for all. Everything is linked below, and I will see you in the next one. Ciao.